First of all, I'm going to introduce Chiara Gardner, who is with our platinum sponsor today, GearSet. So Chiara has been presenting in front of her cats, and she's all the way over from Cambridge, so her cats know this presentation inside and out, but we've all been there. We want to know what value we need to deliver to our clients or end users. So Chiara's going to tell us how we can do that a little bit faster and with less effort. So give a huge round of applause to Chiara. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Morning, everyone. Hi, getting to go first, very exciting. So, yeah, this morning I'm going to be talking to you about delivering value to your users faster and with less effort. But what we really mean here is how we take an idea about a problem that you want to solve or a solution you want to build and how you ensure that turns into real value for your users, which, you know, it's our happy place. It's all full of rainbows and unicorns. But that doesn't feel like a terribly controversial thing to say, right? Like, hands up, like, how many of us are trying to deliver value for our users, whoever they are? I promise I'm only going to make you do this twice more. Cool. Yeah, so most of us, right? That's what we're here, that's what we're aiming to do. But how many of us consistently deliver value to our users? That's good. Some people. Eamon from GearSet consistently gives value to the users. Thanks, Eamon. Yeah, so it's really hard, right? Like, I definitely don't do it every time. But, you know, why is that such a tough thing to do? And I think, really, there's reasons being that we often fall into build traps. And build traps are really ways of working that just make it harder to actually deliver value to our users. And there's lots of different kinds of build traps, but there's three that I see most commonly. And the first one of these is what we call the feature factory. So in that scenario, you're basically told to build something, you don't know why, you don't have context. Normally it's the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, who's telling you, go build the thing. If you're an engineer, it probably feels like you're being locked away in a room and told what to do, but not really knowing why. And the important thing is you ship the feature at the end of it. Whether or not it's actually useful, don't know, but you got it done. So that's the feature factory. The second one I see most commonly is what I call shipping to the void. So you might have a good idea about why you're doing something, you've got some context, but as soon as you've shipped it, you move on to the next thing. You don't know whether or not it's landed well, you don't know whether or not it's provided value. And the final one that I see most commonly is what I call the puppy. And with the puppy, is you might have a really good idea about why you're doing something and you get really enthusiastic and you're really excited about it. And you put loads of time and effort into it and you're working really hard, often for quite a long time on something. But as you start getting closer and closer, you start getting to that release point, you start getting a little bit more worried about whether or not this is going to land. And then when you actually ship it, you find it's not what you expected. And you end up feeling kind of like this. I've definitely had projects where I've launched something and felt like this, because either your users don't use what you've built or they just don't like it. Do any of these sound familiar? Last question. Anyone experienced any of these? I've definitely experienced all of these at various points in my career, yeah. So what's missing in all of these scenarios? Now, there's a whole bunch of different stuff that could be missing, but the key one for me is evidence. In all of these cases, you haven't had enough evidence before, during, or after building something to know whether or not it's actually going to be valuable to users. Now, there's potentially many other things that influence whether or not you're in a build trap. It could be around strategy, culture, process. Those things are all relevant and valid, but they're really hard to influence, and they often take a really, really long time. So today I'm going to focus on how we can get more evidence, because whatever your role, whatever seniority you are, whatever your experience, it's something you can impact, which is getting more evidence before you ship something. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a model that I like to use, and I've used on a few projects as well. And we'll spend a little bit of time. I'm going to try and get through the theory fairly quickly, and then I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples where I've used it. And hopefully we should have some time at the end for questions. So, to the model. So this framework is a graph. And what we're going to start with is the y-axis, so the vertical one there. And what we have on there is evidence. And really, the first things you want to do when you're starting a piece of work is you want to set your evidence bar for where you think your current evidence is, like how much evidence do you have now, and how much evidence do you want to have before you ship. So you feel confident that the thing you're going to do is going to actually land with your users. But what does that mean? What does having a lot of evidence or not a lot of evidence mean? Do you count the number of user conversations you have, the number of tests you might have run and experiments or prototypes you've built? It's not very tangible, right? It's quite hard. So how can you quantify that? So something that's a little bit more human is, sorry, bear with me. That's me setting my where we are currently in terms of confidence, and then potentially the bar that you want to get to in terms of the evidence that you have before you ship. But it's hard, like I said, question mark. So a good proxy for evidence, though, is confidence. How confident do you feel that the thing you're going to ship is going to be valuable to your users? But again, that's still a little bit vague. It's a little bit easier. Yes, I'm very confident. I'm not confident at all. But it's very, very subjective. So the thing that I like to use is basically a betting framework. It just makes it more tangible. So the scale I tend to use, and you can use whatever one you want, is you want a scale of low to high value bets. And I start with a cup of coffee as the bottom one, and then I work my way up through a day's salary, a holiday, a car, and a house. You can pick whatever you want. But basically, if you start thinking about how much evidence you have or how much confidence you have in terms of a bet that you'd be willing to place, it starts to get a bit more tangible. It's a little bit like planning poker, if you've ever done that with Agile. What you might be thinking at this point, though, is just well, that's really subjective, right? I might only feel that I would be confident enough, or I've got enough evidence that I would place a cup of coffee that this thing is going to land, but someone else might have a completely different view. And that's totally fine, because the important thing about this model and whatever you do is that you bring that whole team together and you have the conversation. Why is my bet different to yours? And then you get to a place of kind of shared understanding. This should make a little bit more sense as we go through. So back to the graph. So I then add those bets to your y-axis, and that's your kind of nice proxy for evidence. And what you do is, again, we're trying to think about what's our current amount of evidence, what's our current confidence level that the thing we're going to build is going to land. And you ask a question, and these questions I've referenced all at the end. So the question you ask is, what would you bet that this has value for the user, whatever your idea is? And everyone places their bets, has that conversation, you kind of come to some level of agreement on what that is. And that's where your idea sits. And then what you want to do is you want to, bear with me, sorry. You then want to ask a second question, because that's where you are now, is where do you want to be confidence-wise, evidence-wise, before you release, so that you're avoiding those build traps. And this one's a little bit harder. But the question you ask here is very similar, but it's what should you bet that this has value for the user? Now, again, that can be a bit hard to think about, but some examples where you might want to place a bigger bet would be something that's really hard to reverse. So it might be a breaking change, it might be a new pricing structure, it might be a big change to a feature that everybody really, really loves. So basically, it's quite risky. Things that maybe need smaller bets, less evidence, less confidence, would be things that are really easy to roll back, maybe small little incremental changes. They might need a lower evidence bar. Another question you could ask there is just how bad would it be if it went wrong? And if it's really bad, then you probably want to place a higher bet. But basically what you're trying to do, and why by setting what you think is an appropriate amount of evidence, you're avoiding that feeling of when you're about to ship, you're avoiding feeling like this, and ideally feeling a bit more like this. Just chilled. Yeah, it's going to land. It's going to be fine. So that's what we're aiming for, happy dogs. So, like I said, you have those conversations, you ask that question, and ideally you've set your evidence bar of where you want to get to. So we know where we are now, we know where we want to get to, So then the next step is thinking about how do we actually increase that confidence and evidence if our ultimate goal is to release it and give value to our users. So this is where the x-axis comes in. So along the x-axis is your level of investment and effort of things that you're going to do, basically a range of experiments that will help you build your confidence, build your evidence that the thing that you're doing is actually going to be valuable to users. Now, I'm not going to talk you through every single possible experiment that you could possibly do here in a lot of detail. Like, if you Google, there are like a bajillion different things that will tell you that. I've referenced a couple of articles at the end of these in the slides if you want to find out. But basically, if you Google quantitative and qualitative, that's hard to say first thing in the morning, product tests, you'll find lots of really good articles with lots of different experiments and tests that might be suitable for you and your organization. So find the ones that are right for you. But I'm going to take you through a few that I've used and the examples where I've used them. So something that's least effort is looking at what you already have data-wise. So that could be metrics, previous research you've done, customer support tickets, could even be internal conversations with people. That's really quick to do, right? That's not very much effort to get a sense of the idea that you've got. Is this good? Are we getting any signals this is the right thing? And what happens is with every step of the way, as you go through, maybe in having user conversations, you ask that question again around, like, what bet would you place? For every time you've learned something new, every time you've run a new experiment, asking that question and seeing if you're shifting that bar as you go through into paper tests, prototypes, which are a little bit more involved, A/B testing, potentially running an early access program, a beta release where you're just releasing to a small part of your user base, all the way through to that release. And ideally matching up that evidence. Again, everyone's going to look slightly different here, but the way you're aiming to is build more evidence so that when you release, you know that thing is going to land. What we're really trying to do here, and the question actually you're really asking is like, are we there yet? That's what you're trying to do. And the reason that that's important and the way it helps you avoid some of those build traps as well is by being kind of roughly where that line on the graph is. It keeps you out of two zones. And the first zone is under the graph. And if you're going under the graph, you're going too fast. You're not building enough evidence before you ship. Equally, though, you want to stay out of the top half as well, above the graph, because there it's really too slow. You're spending a lot of time gathering more and more evidence that you're not really learning anything new. You've already got to where you need to be. And that's also risky because there's kind of an opportunity cost, because if you're delivering more slowly, you're delivering less total value to your users over time, or your competitors might get there first. So that's the model. And I'm going to talk you through a couple of examples. So SQL Prompt is a product that I worked on previously at another company. And essentially what it does is it helps SQL developers write SQL code better. It's kind of like, if you're not like super techie, it's a bit like autocomplete for writing SQL. Now this product, at the time we did this work, be around for like 15 years. It was super popular. We had 100,000 active users. It was great. It was really, really well loved. But it was kind of done from an individual point of view. It was pretty much feature complete. So at this point, our strategy wasn't to spend any more time on the product individually, but we wanted to see if there were any other revenue streams that we could take advantage of. Like, what else could we do here? And one of the things we looked at, we did start looking at a little bit of data, and we found that actually a lot of our customers had multiple people who use SQL prompts, but we hadn't ever really thought about exactly doing anything for teams. It would all be very targeted at the individual. So we kind of had this idea, could we create something of value for teams? That was our idea. Let's see if we can do like a team version of prompt. And by we in this scenario, I mean 5 software engineers, a designer, a product manager, and actually our product marketing manager also got involved super early because this was quite a commercially focused piece of work. So back to the graph. So like I said, we had some rumblings around from the data about team sizes, and some of the things we were starting to hear. We'd had like a few odd requests and things, and we kept hearing the word standardization. But that's all we really knew at that point. And we were thinking about, right, well, where should we set our evidence bar? Like, how confident do we want to be? What's the bet that we should place that when we hit that button, we're going to feel, you know, in that happy dog place where we're like, actually, this is going to be fine. We know this is going to land. We thought this would be pretty big. If we were launching a new pricing tier, we could be potentially changing the product around a little bit. The chances of us annoying people was quite high. So we decided actually it was a pretty risky thing to do. So for us, it was a pretty high bet, somewhere between car and house. I mean, unless any of you own 10 houses, I don't think any of us would seriously bet a house on a piece of work that we were shipping to users, but you get the idea. We were then thinking about our current evidence, and as I said, it was pretty low. Like, it was a bit of data and some rumors. So, you know, we were like kind of cup of coffee sure that it was going to be the right thing to do. We basically had an idea at this point. But the data we'd looked at did give us a little bit more confidence that maybe there was something in here. Like I said, there were lots of teams that were using SQL prompt. So that nudged the bar up for us a little bit. So the next step, we spoke to some users. We had some conversations, and with all of them, every single user we spoke to was talking about standardization, team leads. They really wanted to standardize things. You know, they were having challenges with new starters, and they really wanted to make sure everyone was working in the same way. So we were like, okay, standardization, that's the way to go. And we were feeling pretty good about this because like all our users were telling us standardization is what we want. So feeling pretty good. We did some paper tests. So in that scenario, basically our designer mocked up some screenshots of what the product could look like. And again, everything we were focused around was like, how do we help standardize? How do we help enforce rules, comply with company standards? But what happened was when we actually showed them that, those designs, we kind of had our own like sad puppy experience because it really wasn't resonating with people. They just weren't getting it. They're like, I don't really care, even though they'd been telling us that's what they wanted. But when we dug into it, and particularly that thing around those new starter challenges, the problem was actually that it was hard for people to get up to speed, or where someone had done something good, they had a new style, they had like a new snippet or something. It was really hard to share that between people. So what they actually really wanted was much more sharing and collaboration features, even though they were talking about it around standardization. So while our confidence dropped around the standardization thing, and we were like, standardization is not the way to go, we'd still kind of learned something. Because we'd learned, okay, maybe sharing and collaboration is actually the direction we want to go in. So next, we went back, we did more paper tests, started to get a little bit more traction, started to do some more sort of like clickable prototypes. Again, hadn't built any code at this point, but we were starting to get some sense of, yes, this is what people want. We're getting many more like positive noises. So from prototypes, we skipped A/B testing, partly because it didn't really work for us, and partly because we just didn't have that capability in the product. It was not worth the effort putting it in. And we did an early access program. So an early access program, a group of small number of curated users, like 20 teams. And we actually started building some features and sharing it with them. And because we'd obviously been burned before by our error with standardization, we spent quite a long time working with those users, getting like lots of really intensive feedback around that. And at that point, again, all the way through, we were checking our confidence levels. And we were pretty comfortable at that point that our kind of bet of where we were then lined up with the bet that we'd set ourselves. So we didn't bother with beta either, because actually at that point we had enough confidence. And we made the call to release. And when I say we, I do mean people in that team. We all decided together. It wasn't me as the product manager saying we're good to go. We all decided that that was the right thing to do. And now this is part of the team's offering. This exists, this is on the website. What you'll notice is, though, the first word is standardizing. And that was the neat thing about having our product marketer involved from the word go, because he knew that when we were talking to people, they thought they wanted standardization. But if you look at the features that we actually shipped, it's all about sharing and collaboration. And yeah, it ended up landing well. and we managed to avoid that risk. And what we did there is we avoid that too risky zone at the bottom where we were like convinced it was standardization and gone and shipped a bunch of standardization features, which would have been a lot of effort and would have been painful to find out we were wrong, because going back out to those existing customers that we wanted to upsell to would have been really challenging if we'd like really screwed it up first time. So that's the first example. Second example is about a product called GearSet. Yeah, sorry about that. So GearSet as a product does a lot of things, but basically it allows you to compare and deploy Salesforce metadata as XML files from one Salesforce environment to another. It's a DevOps product. I think we've got some exciting DevOps talks coming up, so you'll learn more about that if you don't know more about that already. Anyway, for this, we were looking at a particular type of metadata called flows. And it basically allows less technical people to like drag and drop different workflows in Salesforce. And yeah, it's nice and visual. You don't have to be super techy to use it. Now, the problem is when you then go to sort of deploy these changes to a new environment, if you're like, I want this workflow, but I want to move it to a different environment, when you go into GearSet, it looks like this. That's very different, right? So we were pretty sure that there was something in this. We also had heard that this type of metadata was super important to Salesforce. And so we kind of knew that this was an idea, like something we should look into. But it was all pretty vague at this point. We also realized we couldn't really set where our evidence bar was because we didn't even really know what the problems were at this point. We just knew it was we felt like it was worth looking into. So we didn't really worry about setting our evidence bar at this point. But we knew we wanted to release something. Our current confidence level when we started this was, again, like it was very low, cup of coffee. Like we don't even really know what the problems are. We don't know where we can add value. So we did a couple of things. We looked into our data. We saw some kind of the common error messages that were coming up for flows. We had lots and lots of conversations with users, either through interviews or through our customer support tool, Intercom. But at this point, again, all we had was like a whole bunch of different ideas of lots of different problems we can solve. Also at that time, it wasn't a priority for us to actually spend loads of time on this. We know we want to do it at some point, but we didn't want to do it all straight away. However, we were coming up to Christmas, and some of the engineers had a little bit of time. So it was just like, well, maybe we can pick something that we can do here. Maybe we just take one idea through. And at that point, yeah, we had this like one small idea. And basically, when you move those boxes around, it generates loads of XML that relates to the location changes. And it was just taking up loads of screen space. And basically, every single user we spoke to told us it just wasn't useful. So that kind of increased our confidence a little bit that that was going to be something that was worth solving, because everyone said. But the other thing we realized through doing that is that we didn't necessarily need to be super confident about where we wanted to hit or how much evidence we needed to do this, because potentially we were talking about a really small improvement. It was kind of, people were managing to deploy without this thing, but it was quite painful. So, it might just be like a nice surprise if we introduce this into the product. And if it wasn't ideal, we'd be able to roll it back and take it out of the product really quickly. So we understood better where to set our evidence bar, which was, there we go, a little bit lower. So we were actually kind of pretty much there. We were like, well, we've had loads of conversations. We think this is probably a good idea. This is clearly painful for everyone. Everyone finds this super annoying. We felt pretty good about that. We happened to have a couple more user research calls scheduled. So our designer just mocked up a couple of ideas. We put those in front of users. It like totally made sense to them. They totally got it straight away. So again, just gave us like another little nudge in the confidence bar. Nothing astronomical, but just a little bit more confident that we were doing the right thing. And so then we just shipped it, because an engineer, a really smart engineer, in an afternoon put something together and built this. Just a neat little toggle where you could just turn off anything that you couldn't see. And the reason we were able to kind of be so bullish about shipping it is we were really clear about what would cause us to roll it back. So we weren't shipping into the void and moving straight on. We're like, well, we'll listen for user feedback because they definitely give us feedback if they don't like something. We'll listen for good stuff too. And we'll also just have some like metrics in there to check how often it's being used. You know, if it's not being used at all, then we know that, you know, it's not useful and we'll pull it back out again. Fortunately, it did land well. We did get some positive feedback and we saw that, you know, the numbers went up. People were using that toggle. Now, I use this example because if we'd done more work here, we could have gone through more of these things. We would have fallen into that slow zone, and we wouldn't have like learned much more. We learned more by shipping it than we would have done if we'd spent more time in kind of the theoretical side of things. So for this, you know, everyone's journey around this stuff looks different. Every bit of work is different, you know, depending on your risk appetite, your organization's risk appetite. Your evidence bar might be really high. Your evidence bar might be quite low. Your journey there is probably going to be pretty wobbly. It's not going to be that beautiful line in most circumstances. But even better, it should hopefully stop you shipping stuff that isn't going to be value and give you a way of actually like killing ideas before you get to the point where you actually put them into the product, if they're going to be difficult to roll back. And that's quite a brave thing to do. It can be quite hard, but it's really powerful if you can do it. And I'm not saying that you even need to like use this graph as a framework or, you know, monitor and track things every step of the way. It's more about how you think about the problem and how you think about moving your confidence in evidence along and building it up. So, takeaways in your unicorn party bags for you at the end of this talk. So just be aware of those build trap scenarios. They're really, really common. Just notice if you're in them. Try using that vetting framework to help you determine whether or not your level of confidence or evidence where it should be or where it could be, asking what would or should you bet that this has value for the user. And adjust it to fit your needs. Like, you absolutely don't need to use it exactly as I put it up there. And with that, I would also say if you're like, oh, this is great, I really want to go and try this model, don't try it all in one go, particularly if you're in like a feature factory. Don't go and slap this graph down and be like, solved it, this is what we're going to do. Maybe just pick one or two elements from it. You know, maybe try and have a few, you know, if you're an engineer, try and be in on some of those user conversations. Maybe think about introducing that idea if you're doing planning poker, maybe thinking about using the bets thing for evidence. Use it in a way that's useful for you. Any questions? I think, is there a question up at the back? There's a question right up at the back over there.
Hello, can you hear me? Thanks very much. It was a really good presentation. I just want to ask one question. Where you say you had loads of conversations, what does that mean? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 200? How do you measure that, and how do you make sure you've got the right number?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to give the typical product manager answer of it depends. But a good rule of thumb generally is if you're hearing, they often use a number of around like 7 is like a fairly good proxy. If you consistently hear the same thing from 7 people, then you're probably in about the right place. You can probably be fairly confident around that. In the second example, I think we had about 10 research calls with people, but we'd also put a pop-up on Intercom, which is our like in-app chat, and asked people for feedback, and we probably had about 20 other bits of feedback there. So in that case, it was kind of around that. But yeah, I'd probably say, 5 probably isn't enough. If it's a really massive change, maybe look more in the sort of 15 to 20 region, but anything beyond that is probably diminishing returns. No worries. Question over there?
If you're having the conversations, but you have a lot of stakeholder disagreements, you said then to kind of have a conversation with 20 people, but if you have there's not a clear consensus at the end, what would your approach be then?
Are you talking about speaking to users or internally within your organisation?
Internally.
Yeah, that is always a tricky one. I think with that, again, we'll say it depends on your situation, but hopefully you've got someone who is leading that particular piece of work. It's probably your product manager in that situation. It might be a project manager. And again, happy to have a chat with you because sounds like that's maybe a very specific question behind that question. But yeah, I think it's just giving people a chance to voice those things. I think you have to get it out. There's always going to be one or two people who disagree very, very strongly and might be really upset that everyone's set it at holiday level when they feel like it's a car or whatever it is. But I think if you're regularly having that check-in, you're regularly allowing people to be heard, normally people get to the point of having some kind of consensus. But I'm happy to have a chat. There's like other different techniques and tools you can use. I'm happy to have a more in-depth chat about that if you want to come and find me later. Not very hard to miss. Anything else? We might be pretty much on time. We're on time, Kim, is that all right? I'll leave you to it. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.